All right, third and last preview for this morning and last video before we leave. St. Louis. So it's like I timed it this way, right? The defending Stanley Cup champions. The preview for 2019-2020. Can they do it again? The answer is why not? Kind of, sort of, why not? When you look at their current roster, the most obvious that's on his way that basically is out the door is Patrick Maroon, but it's a pretty solid roster top to bottom. Why not? Now they had 99 points last year. Pretty good total. They had 94 the year before that and 99 the year before that. And in years prior, 107 and 109. So this is a team that's been pretty good for a while and then just got hot at the exact right time. I don't want to diminish, though, what St. Louis did because there's enough of that going on as it is. They weren't that good. They were last in the league, which shows they weren't that good, which is really weird reasoning that because a team was playing poorly in November, that means that them winning a Stanley Cup in June is somehow diminished. Because that's really what happened here. So in goals for, they were 15th in the NHL, 247 goals against. They had 223 goals against. That's 6th in the NHL. And their defense was pretty good all year. But in October, they were 3-4-3. And at the end of November, they were 9-12-3. So we all get hooked on this. Where were they in January? The reason they were where they were in January is because they were miserable in October and November. And what I remember too was this was a home heavy schedule. I remember saying the only way that St. Louis is going to save this season is if they can play better on the road than they do at home. And then they did. Now in December, they ended up 15, 18, and 4. So you'll notice they were 3 games below 500 at the end of November. They were 3 games below 500 at the end of December. They weren't playing badly at that point. They just couldn't string wins together. January, they were 22, 22, and 5 at the end of January. And of course, famously, they were at the bottom of the league early in January, which is what everybody focuses on. Again, for me, I focus on November and where they were in December. That's where they kind of bottomed out. February, they're 34, 23, and 6 at the end of that month. March, they're 42, 28, and 8 at the end of that month. And they looked like the best team in the West going into the playoffs. They were 45, 28, and 9 at the end of the season. So when you look at where they were, they ended up going 36, 16, and 6 after November. So it's easy to sort of write it off and go, well, they had a good 3 months. In reality, they played well from December on. They played 500 hockey or better from December on every month. But October and November were brutal months. That October, it looked like it sunk their season. 3 wins in their first 10. And it was a similar story for Florida and New Jersey. And of course, Florida and New Jersey didn't pull themselves out of it. Now, for New Jersey, they won their first 4 and then fell back by the end of that month. But for St. Louis, it just looked bad. And it was especially since a lot of these wins were at home. Then you look at them in the Stanley Cup finals and the Stanley Cup playoffs in general. They could win on the road. They couldn't win at home. That was just sort of how their season went. Now, if we're going to name an MVP coming into this season, I went back and forth on a few different players. Tarasenko, I thought about Pietrangelo, O'Reilly, but honestly, it's Jordan Binnington. Without Jordan Binnington coming in and putting the team on his back, and without that hot run that they had with him, they likely don't end up being in the playoffs. And let's say they eke their way into the playoffs with Jake Allen as the starter, I don't think they would have got out of the first round. I think St. Louis would have had their struggles with Jake Allen that they didn't have with Binnington, which is not an insult to Allen. I think Allen had a decent year, but it's just Binnington was that much better. Now, of course, as stated, they won the Stanley Cup this year, which everybody knows. 2018, they were out of the playoffs altogether. So that's unusual. No playoffs and then Stanley Cup. 2017, they made it to round 2. 2016, they made it to round 3. In round 3, they lost to the Sharks that year. And in 2015, they were out in the first round. So they've been in all 4 rounds of the playoffs in the last 5 years, and they won that 4th round this year to finally win a Stanley Cup and put that whole drought out of its misery. And as I stated, Patrick Maroon is the most public profile player that's not going to be with this team this year that was with the team last year. They just don't have the cap space to bring him back. Currently, Barbashev is the only one left to sign as a restricted free agent. And honestly, there are some kids who might be ready to step into this lineup that could make up for the loss of Maroon. Maybe not physically, but they can make up for the loss definitely when it comes to the offensive side of things. And it might give a team that they're playing against a little bit something different to get ready for. Now, for goals, Vlad Tarasenko. And I take some heat for my opinion on Tarasenko. Here's my honest opinion of Vlad Tarasenko. 2 years ago, I picked him to win the Rocket Richard Trophy. I think Vlad Tarasenko could be the best pure goal scorer outside of Ovechkin in the National Hockey League. But he tends to go quiet. And so he ends up with 33 goals. He gets his goals. He ends up getting there by the end of the year. But he has those droughts. If he could cut those down and cut them out altogether, you're looking at a guy who can score 50 goals a year. He has that level of talent. And that's why it's frustrating when he goes through these valleys of not scoring. And sometimes you'd hardly know he was out there. And so it makes it more frustrating when you know what he can do. I think he's their best goal scorer. Dark horse, I went with Robert Thomas. Yes, if you're a Blues fan, you know what Robert Thomas may very well be able to do this coming season. If you are not a fan of the Blues, it may be a surprise to you. So act surprised. Thomas, really, in all honesty, he should be top 6. He probably ends up playing on that second line at some point this year. What about? I went with Jordan Kyrou. Kyrou kind of had a false start as a rookie this year. I expect that to change in 2019-2020 from where it was in 2018-2019. There won't be any pressure on him really either because this team just won a Stanley Cup. All the pressure's off. You expect the Stanley Cup hangover. Fans are still happy. Even if this team fell to 80 points and missed the playoffs, fans are still like, hey, we won a Stanley Cup. It's totally worth it. They'll come back next year. So there's no pressure on this team, really, hardly at all. Trade bait, I went with Jake Allen. As stated before, Allen's still a decent goaltender, and there are enough teams in the league that need a goaltender that I think Allen could get showcased at some point this season. Likely not early, but I would think later on in the season, maybe around trade deadline, somebody who's looking like, man, we might make the playoffs, we want to improve our goaltending, Allen might be seen as an improvement. Allen takes a lot of criticism. That some of it's warranted, but for me, Jake Allen's still a half-decent goaltender in this league, and I think with a change of scenery, he can absolutely get his game back. We'll see. Now, their lineup is still pretty formidable in that they'll roll 4 lines. So their lines are fluid, much like many teams in the league. Jaden Schwartz, Braden Shen, Vlad Tarasenko. That's a pretty decent top 3 right there. And then Sammy Blais or Zach Sanford ends up on that second left wing. Ryan O'Reilly, David Perron, and as I said, Robert Thomas. I would expect to fight David Perron for that number 2 spot. But Zach Sanford, Tyler Bozak, Robert Thomas. You really can't go wrong with any of these top 3 lines. Alex Steen, Ivan Barbashev, Oscar Sundqvist. Sundqvist showed himself up to... he proved that he's a good player this past season. He scored well. And yeah, he did cross lines here and there during the playoffs. And, he's been on the receiving end and the giving end of controversial hits. But he is a hard-nosed player. That's kind of the edge he plays on. He will cross it. And this Steen winds down his career, offering a solid veteran leader for them and not complaining about playing less. So Jordan Nolan sits on the outside. Nathan Walker was picked up as a free agent. It would be interesting to see if they did win back-to-back cups, how Nathan Walker would spend his day with the Stanley Cup. I'm guessing in Australia. Clem Costin, Jordan Kyrou, these guys are both going to push for roster spots this year. And that's part of the reason why you can let go of a Patrick Maroon. And Nick Lappin as well. He got into some games last year, so he may very well get to play some games this year. I'm not worried about a lack of overall depth at all up front. This is a very solid, very well-coached team, and if they need to make any changes, they need to fix anything, they have depth in other parts of the organization. Let's just say something happened to one of their centers, they'll figure it out. I'm not worried about it. Doug Armstrong's a good general manager. On the blue line, you got Joel Edmondson, Alex Pietrangelo, Jay Bouwmeester, Colton Parayko. Vince Dunn, who's underrated. We'll see if he pushes his way into one of those top 2 spots. And Robert Bortuzzo. Now, that would push Carl Gunnarsson out of the lineup. Gunnarsson and Bortuzzo likely will switch out who's in on whatever night, depending on what game Craig Berube wants to play. If he wants a more physical game, he'll have Bortuzzo in there. If it's a skill game, it'll be Gunnarsson. Jake Dotchin was added in the offseason. He's just depth. Derek Pouliot added in the offseason as well. He'll be a depth guy for them. Andreas Borgman and... no, I was thinking of somebody else, but no, I'm going to leave it because that player's not still there. But anyways, we'll see how this blue line plays itself out because I like Borgman. He didn't get a shot with Toronto last year, but I do like Borgman. I think he's a good defenseman. Derek Pouliot desperately needed a change out of Vancouver. I think this is his last chance at a job in the National Hockey League. I would not be surprised to see him on waivers and end up in the American League to start the year, though. Which leaves you with goaltending, and that's where these guys really have it that they didn't a year ago. Remember, a year ago we're talking about Jake Allen and can he get his game back, and if he can't, this team's in deep trouble. Ville Husso was seen as the number 3. Chad Johnson was the number 2. And Jordan Binnington was just some petulant child that wouldn't take a demotion to the East Coast League when asked. How dare he? Now, Binnington's a hero. He's your Stanley Cup champion. Allen's the backup, and Husso's still the number 3 in the organization. And we'll see what happens with this trio this year. Does Jake Allen end up getting moved at some point for depth somewhere else? This will be an interesting year in that, like I said, there's no pressure on these guys. So does the general manager put that pressure on himself? Does the coach, do the players put that pressure on themselves to prove it again? Or do they kind of maybe take a bit of a step back this year after winning a Stanley Cup? It happens where you have that Stanley Cup hangover. And that's kind of what this looks like in this year's results, but it's not there. If I had to pick where the Blues could finish, I don't see them as a first place team, but I could see them being as high as second. I could see them as low as fifth. I don't think that happens. I think it would have to be something disastrous. But remember, and I said this in the San Jose preview I just finished, I think 5 teams in the Central make the playoffs and 3 in the Pacific. So, in all likelihood, I can't see St. Louis falling out of the playoffs. There will be a lot of people trying to predict this team misses the playoffs. I think with this defense, with Binnington in net, and a solid top 6, I think they're good. I think they could use another scorer on the left side, but you know what? It's a formula that worked for them last year. So because they win a Stanley Cup, I don't see any reason to jump on them and go, well, they got to fix this and they got to fix that, because there really isn't a whole lot that they need to do. And they don't really have the cap space to make improvements even if they wanted to right now. This may very well be a big year for Alex Pietrangelo, who's a free agent next summer. And with a couple of contracts up next summer, Braden Shen being another one, we may see St. Louis have more of a sense of urgency if they feel like those players may leave. So that may provide them a sense of urgency that spurs them on to a better season. But it's going to be interesting in that this was a team that I predicted to go to the Stanley Cup Finals, to lose against Tampa. So I'm not going to give myself too much credit because none of us really saw what was going to happen. This Tampa just... But at that being said, I think this team is better than some people give it credit for. And that happens when you win a Stanley Cup. You're going to have a huge party, and you're still going to have people who have their arms folded off to the side going, yeah, they weren't good enough. I don't accept this. It's just the way things work. But let me know what you guys think. Where do you think these guys finish? Who ends up being their leading scorer? All this other wonderful stuff. And can Tarasenko have that 50-goal season? Maybe I'm still mad at him because I picked him to win a Rocket Richard trophy and he didn't even get close. Maybe it's that simple. But let me know your thoughts. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. And hey, thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.